Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajim. Bismillahir-rahmanir-rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our next discussion on the short story Everyday Use by Alice Walker. Here today we are going to discuss some of the aspects of the story with uh, a discussion on the narrator of the story, the character changes in these character, and the impact of the discussion on the quilts as an art, and some other aspects depicted in the story. Dear students, Alice Walker has used first person narration to tell the story of this small family, the black family, Dee, Maggie, and her mother, the main characters. One of the interesting techniques that Alice Walker as a writer has used to tell her story is by making it a first person narrative told through Mama, the mouthpiece of the writer, an uneducated rural Georgia black woman living in the past, sticking to the past, and unable to understand the progressive present. She is a woman of the past, a woman of the traditions, and is unable to cope with the new happenings of the new world. It is interesting to note that as a narrator, Mama admits to the reader from an early point of the story that she never understood her daughter Dee, and that she and her older daughter clashed from the time that she was a young girl. It is an ever present conflict between the daughter and the mother. Mama doesn't understand Dee, and further, she was hurt by Dee and Dee's urgency to escape Georgia, escape the South, and escape her family, escape her roots, rather. Thus, we may say that Alice Walker has depicted the inability of the narrator to elaborate and understand the situation at hand. Secondly, it is probably the main thing here in the story that the narrator has got a biased viewpoint, as she is unable to understand the whole thing. So already we are being told this in this story by a biased narrator, one who has her own prejudices, her own viewpoints, and her own vision of life, and who possibly lacks the capacity to understand fully who Dee is, or who she has become, and what are the prospects of the progressive future. She is unable to cope with the running times. When Dee comes back from school with a new Muslim boyfriend and a name change and a outlook that is superficially oriented in the African tradition, suddenly claims that she understands her past and wants to preserve it. Mama is understandably confused, hurt, anguished, and angry, unable to understand the change, unable to cope with the change that is there to happen. She lives too much in the past and not in the present at all as a character, as a mother. She lashes out towards Dee in the only way she can by painting a negative picture of her to the reader, and by denying her the quilt that she has so desperately wanting to get. That is what makes the narrator a biased narrator. She is not um, at all an impersonal type of narrator. She is a prejudiced and biased narrator in the story. She picks and paints every detail, every character from her own angle, from her own vision, from her own point of view. The quilts become the central conflict in the story. Dee is right that the quilt represents so much about her family's past and even more about the history of blacks in the South. It has had generations of family work on it and even contains a patch from a very old Civil War uniform of a veteran martyr. The main conflict of the story arises when the question of whether this unique quilt should go to Maggie, who plans to use it when she gets married soon in future, or to Dee, who says she wants to hang it up and preserve it as an art. From the title of the story, the reader can probably already guess what Mama thinks and what the fate of the quilt would be. That the quilt is going to be a quilt for everyday use. That is, it will not be preserved as a token of history, as a symbol of historical, monumental importance. Rather, it will be a thing of everyday use to keep it running on as a living history, a spirit of the past running through everyday use of a thing that is made for everyday use, the quilt. Dear students, as we have looked upon the character of the narrator, Mama, from the point of view of the narrator in the story, we have come to know that she is unable to understand the reality of things due to many factors: her prejudiced viewpoint, her lack of education, her cultural background, her traditional way of thinking, her sticking to the past, living too much in the past, and not touching upon the horizons of the present ever changing world of today, the new realities. Then, coming on to the next character that is also presented as a traditional and rigid character in the story, the second sister, Maggie. Maggie is easily the most pathetic character in the story, you say. Whether she is clueless because of a mental disability, as she suffered a fire break in the house, or because of her lack of exposure to the outer world, the education, and the outside world, she seems to be dominated by Dee and her mother and her environment and her house environment indeed. But remember that the reader is only getting this information through the viewpoint of Mama, a prejudiced narrator in the story. There is some question about whether Mama just sees what she wants to see. Whether it is a question, and a very big question to be answered, whether it is Mama who is holding her back from going out into the world of the new, changing, emerging new world of new realities. It is the mother who is holding her back, taking her into the past with her to the traditional world of her own living. It is again Mama who even blames Dee for the accident that left Maggie crippled, disabled, apparently crippled, and walking with a limp, scratches and scars on her face. Maggie doesn't want to get in the way of her sister. And when Dee wants the quilt, Maggie tells Mama just to let her have it. It is a sense of sacrifice on the part of the sister. But Mama seems determined to put her foot down and finally stand up to Dee. So she insists that Maggie should take the quilt, despite Dee's protests that the quilt will then just be for everyday use. But Dee is not unsympathetic to her sister. As she leaves, she encourages Maggie to get away from the restrictions and tells her that it is a whole new world outside there, a world that Dee has discovered through education and exposure. And she also invites her sister to come out of the shackles of this household and get her life renewed, enlightened, brightened up. Dear students, we know that D, as a character and as a human being, as a daughter, as a sister, gets a very bad impression from the narrator from the very beginning of the story, gets a bad rap from the very beginning, since the reader is set up to dislike her by the narrator and be suspicious of her because of Mama. Some careful reading and analysis reveals what is good about D as well. While D initially shook the dust off her feet and refused all the pieces of home, her education, something blacks and women could not previously get, has allowed her to understand the importance of her southern heritage and its place in black history. She is able to find out her true identity as a black woman. She does sweep in with all these changes and is demanding and overwhelms Mama and the household. We know from Mama that she has always had a commanding presence, and it makes her a vigorous character present in the story as a force. Very willful force indeed. One of Mama's criticism of Dee is how much she has changed. Mama questions Dee's name change and her new African inspired dress, although it is all appearance. Dee tries to explain why she made these choices, but Mama sees it as an affront, an attack to their personal history and not what it truly is. Dee's understanding of the deeper history of blacks in the South. It is the conflict of two viewpoints. However, Dee is not wrong that her name, that came from her grandmother, actually has its roots in slavery, and she has thrown away, wiped out that sign of slavery from her own life, adopting a new name, new African name. At some point, her family's roots were African, and when they were forcibly brought into slavery in the United States, one of the ways they were stripped of their identity recognition as human beings was through the owner changing their names. When the slaves were brought into the United States, the owners of the slaves were allowed to change the names, and that is what she has stripped off, thrown away the name given to her by her slave masters, and she has adopted her true identity, taking a name from her origin, the African origin indeed. Again, dear students, this education has exposed these truths to her, and she chooses this way to express her anger over what was done to her by people, the removal of their past. She also attempts to re-establish that connection by expressing herself through dress and name change, adopting new ways in the new world of today. What Mama doesn't understand, rather fails to understand, is that these changes are not a rejection of Mama or her family or the traditions she follows. The opposite is actually true. These changes show that Dee is trying to establish a deeper understanding and connection with her history, something Mama is either unable or unwilling to do. Dee's execution of these changes may be imperfect or superficial, but the reasons behind them are not completely invalid. They are true. Then, my dear students, another question arises out of this story. Why Alice Walker has used quilts? There is the answer to this question. Critics agree that Alice Walker has used these quilts as a symbol of art, as it is all a European idea to use the age old things, articles, objects as symbols of art. Here in this story, the quilts have been used for many purposes. First of all, they represent the conflict in the family. Then they also represent the history symbol of the family. Then they also point to the history of the African Americans. Then they stand as an art themselves, a piece of art that is a true piece of art, preserved from the past to the present, a symbol of preserving the past in the new age, the ever changing world. The quilt in question may be an art. The central argument D makes is that the quilt in question is art and history and should not be used for everyday use, as the everyday use might spoil, might damage and harm the art and history itself. Mama believes that quilts are made to be used for everyday use, so they should be used, should not be preserved as an art and history. While the quilt in question was created out of practicality through several generations and was intended for use as a bed cover, its heritage and history may have elevated it to a higher, more important place. The idea of practical art is deeply rooted in African customs. Beautiful baskets, mats, blankets were made to be pleasing to the eye as well as be very useful in household, in everyday life. That is, we may say that this quilt used in this story has got two uh, lives. One is the spirit of the art as a living spirit, living force running through everyday use of the domestic life, always present, always emerging, always overwhelming. And secondly, the second phase of this quilt is an art as a display to be preserved, to be kept intact for the next generations to see it. Dear students, art for art's sake is a European idea as we have discussed earlier. But the depth of importance of this particular quilt cannot be denied, and the story it tells of the generations of black women who worked on it elevates it to the status of art. And possibly D is right. It is not only art, it is art that needs to be preserved. Mama seems intent on punishing D and not forgiving her. Dee was young when she left her home and refused the quilt. Her education helped her to grow up and understand her roots and her family's place in history. But it seems that Mama is not quite ready to forgive her, and so the quilt goes to Maggie and will likely be torn, stained, and well used. But with it goes an irreplaceable piece of history as well. Dear students, just for the sake of understanding this conflicting viewpoint about these quilts, just look at how many of us, as uh, members of a society, have something special from a grandparent, great grandparent, or beyond that, the family itself. It is likely that if you do have something like that, it is kept in a place of honor, cherished and preserved because you understand your own family's past and the importance of that connection in tangible objects. The quilt here in this story is no different from this type of feeling. But Dee leaves not completely angry, though understandably disappointed. She tells her sister that there is a new world out there for them as a people, as human beings, and encourages Maggie to come and discover it. Come out of the shackles of that house and discover this new world. Education has changed Dee's life, and it could change Maggie's world too, the limited world. in which she is forced to live. Dear students, here comes the conclusion of our today's debate on different aspects of this story. Inshallah, we will meet in our next session. Till then, it is Allah Hafiz and goodbye from my side. Thank you for participating in today's discussion. Allah Hafiz.